so much for having me here today, Ginger. I'm really excited to speak with everyone.
Well, we have your slides pulled up, so the floor is all yours.
Perfect. Well, if we advance one slide, I thought that since you all can't see me on video, I'd start by taking a moment to introduce myself and show you some pictures of what I look like, both on the job and off. I'm a director in PwC Advisory, and I focus on our digital products, which I'll tell you more about in a little bit. But outside of my job at PwC, I'm an avid trail runner, skier, cook, and Peloton enthusiast. This winter, I became a ski instructor at Beaver Creek, which was a fantastic way to spend my weekends meeting new people in spite of the pandemic. I taught people who took all the precautions, and I also taught those who didn't believe COVID was real. So it gave me some good perspective on the attitude disparities and how different people think that a return to normal should happen. Finally, I live just north of Denver in Superior, where I serve as an elected member of our city council. So I definitely understand the conundrum that government faces in mandating safety measures for employees. So if we go on to our next slide, I want to tell you more about my job at PwC and kind of what our response to COVID has been. I've spent the last 10 years in PwC's advisory practice, where we have a national staffing model. So at PwC, we've always had kind of a dispersed or hybrid workforce. Within audit and tax, that means people are typically working either at the PwC office or the local client site. But within advisory, where I sat, most staff travel to client sites, which could be anywhere in the country, Monday through Thursday. And then on Fridays, we have the option to either work from home or go into the local PwC office. To give you an idea of how hectic my travel schedule was, the first week in March of 2020, I was working in Chicago, New York, Salt Lake City, and Atlanta. So really all over the place. And that was when, in March 2020, we had our first reported case of COVID from a PwC employee. And it was someone at our New York headquarters, which has several thousand employees over dozens of floors, and was also where I had just been working that week. So our HR team embarked on some pretty heroic efforts to try to figure out who had been on which floor, on which day, and at which time. But it took them 5 days to get that info, and that meant we still had to alert several thousand people that they might be at risk. I can say firsthand it was pretty scary to get that email and not really know, who had gotten COVID. Was it somebody that I saw in the break room or somebody who was on the other side of that floor? We ultimately ended up closing all of our offices, which I'm sure many of you did as well. But we also built a technology solution for ourselves, Check-In, and that leveraged existing Bluetooth technology that we had created 5 years before, which was a housekeeper panic button that's been deployed across the hospitality industry. So we took that same Bluetooth technology, but pivoted it over from tracking where someone was in a building to simply tracing who they were in proximity to and for how long. The solution ended up being so successful that our clients were asking to use it as well. So we decided to commercialize the technology, and I moved over to the PwC digital team to lead our go-to-market strategy in deploying it. So now I've spent the last year of the pandemic really staying up to date on all the latest news and guidelines around COVID and speaking with hundreds of clients about their planned return to work strategy in order to be able to change the Check-In product as the market evolves. So for example, we recently added capacity planning capabilities, and next week we're going to be launching vaccine tracking. Anyway, what I've learned from my clients is that with all this uncertainty, companies have a lot of considerations as they're looking to solve the needs of their workforce today and into the future. So if we go on to the next slide, with that context on my background and PwC's story, I wanted to just talk to all of you about what I'm hearing from my clients about the steps that they're taking to make their employees feel more comfortable coming back in person. There's two really big components to address for a successful return to workplace strategy: physical safety and mental comfort. And I think a lot of people are really focusing primarily on that physical side of things, which is great. We've definitely come a long way from when we started. A lot of companies are putting into place daily health surveys that affirm you don't have any symptoms. I've also seen a lot of temperature checks, especially when you have visitors coming into a business. But the temperature checks really aren't that effective, so that's something I think that's a little bit more of a feel-good measure than a physical one. A lot of my clients initially focus on cleaning protocols, but with recent guidance on there being really limited spread by surfaces, the cleaning protocol is a little less important than actually just limiting the number of people in an enclosed space. And the final piece of the physical side of things are masks. As much as they're a little bit of a pain, they're likely here to stay for the foreseeable future. And the majority of employees are on board with this, as you can see in the survey question that I put on the screen. So in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, way back when, we all had to adjust to increased security measures at airports. And those initially seemed pretty onerous, but they soon became an accepted part of the travel experience. So similarly, pandemic response measures might feel kind of onerous now, but our survey results indicate that acceptance is really growing. So someday, I think a lot of these pandemic measures will become just as commonplace as airport security checks, which also means it'll result in more pandemic-prepared workplaces for the future. We do at PwC a workforce pulse survey every couple of months, and in June of 2020, only about a third of employees told us that the measures their leaders were taking were making them feel more confident in their ability to do their jobs. Now, we're here, almost a year later, and that sentiment has barely shifted in spite of all we've learned. So I think that that lack of confidence comes from the mental comfort piece of the return to work equation, which not every workplace is considering. There's a huge productivity loss when employees are nervous about being there in person or about the protocols that are in place and whether they're being followed. So we've spent a year consciously thinking about avoiding other people and stepping to the side when someone approaches us in the grocery store. But now, even after we're fully vaccinated, it's a little scary to unlearn that and then go back to those face-to-face interactions. So with all the upheaval of the last year, I think people are most nervous about the unknown. One thing you can do to address that is make sure you have a really clear communication plan that helps employees decide whether to come in or whether to continue to work remotely. It's really important to communicate upfront exactly what will be expected and then follow through with it. So for example, if you say that it's mandatory for people to wear masks when they're moving around the office or in common areas, it's important to follow through with enforcing it, or else just say masks are optional. Now, what about vaccines? We originally saw the vaccine as kind of a panacea. Once we had one developed, we thought we would all return to normal, or at least I know that's what I thought last summer. But what we've seen in the last few weeks is that vaccinations have slowed dramatically. It's unclear whether we're really going to reach that herd immunity, and it's looking more and more likely that we're going to have to live with periodic COVID-19 outbreaks for years to come. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't advise you on the legality of requiring vaccinations for your employees. But according to one of our more recent remote work surveys, only half of U.S. employees say that they're willing to provide proof of vaccination to their employers. So it's really important that you continue to plan for a multifaceted return to workplace and continue to be operating in the hybrid world for the foreseeable future. So on the next slide, what does that mean? It means we're probably going to be shifting from this working from home model to a work from anywhere model. So at PwC, we're still trying to figure out even where our 40,000 U.S. employees are now living. Some have moved temporarily, and some have moved permanently. This has had really major impacts on our own return to office plan because we've committed to supporting the personal needs of our employees, and that means where they need to live. Now, we're not alone in this trend. According to our March 2021 Workforce Pulse survey, 12% of employees have already moved more than 50 miles away from their core office location, and another 25% are considering doing so. In another survey, while 52% of respondents worked in an office every day before the pandemic, now only 2% say that they want to return to the office full-time. In fact, 68% of respondents clarified that they want to work from home either most of the time or every day. Now, most hybrid work plans ask employees to be in the office 2 to 3 days a week, but that's not practical for those who move more than 50 miles away. So companies that set a policy like that need to decide whether they'll allow people who relocate to work remotely on a permanent basis. They'll also have to set expectations on when remote employees need to come into the office and ensure that they comply with federal and state tax laws, remembering that location flexibility can have implications on both taxes and insurance. But On the flip side, this new work-from-anywhere environment will have a number of benefits, like allowing the opportunity to recruit from a wider pool of talent if you let your employees work remotely full-time. I don't know that this picture of the guy sitting on the beach with his laptop is necessarily practical, but there definitely is some upside for employees. So on the next slide, I want to talk about one piece of that upside, which is flexibility. We're seeing that usually it's the HR organizations and the CHROs who are leading the charge on reimagining work. And most have told us that they've either already invested or they will invest in new tools and trainings that will support virtual work going forward. A lot of organizations realize that they can't simply just go back to normal once the pandemic fully subsides. So instead, the HR leaders are taking charge and designing their new vision for work in the post-pandemic world with the employee experience at the center. So new communication channels and flexibility in where work is done, that's what I would encourage you to embrace. So don't run away from those things. We are going to a different world. Technology can help support that return to in-person collaboration, from video meeting and chat tools to things like the check-in tool I mentioned I work on, which allows you to see where employees are working on any given day and perform that automatic contact tracing. But one of the key benefits for employees of the work-from-anywhere model is flexibility. Part of why those Gen Zers and millennials value the ability to work remotely is the flexibility and autonomy. And as you can see from the chart on the screen, those non-traditional benefits can be very meaningful. At the height of the pandemic, when people were on full lockdown, employees still saw flexibility as a benefit. But now, in these normal, or I would say new normal times, the autonomy that remote work offers is even more valuable. You can go on a run during lunch, you can do school drop-off and pick-up during breaks, or you can adjust your work schedule to the hours when you're most awake, alert, and productive. Plus, working from anywhere allows your workers to move closer to family or to better climates or even to places with a lower cost of living. When the U.S. Patent Organization transitioned a couple years back from work from home to work from anywhere, they found that work from anywhere boosted individual productivity by 4.4%, which is pretty nice for both the company and the employee. So as leaders, I would encourage all of you to think about how you can both provide and take advantage of this flexibility without compromising work outcomes. Allow or even encourage your employees to travel and work from remote locations. And most importantly, allow your employees to choose the best fit for them on where to work on a day-to-day basis. So in the new normal, you won't know that, John is always in the office on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and he's home Tuesdays and Thursdays. Instead, let him decide every day where it makes sense for him to work based on the type of tasks he needs to do or who he needs to meet with. I know this came up earlier in the panel discussion, but consider implementing core hours or core days where everyone in the team is available for meetings. But then allow your employees to choose their own hours on either side of that. The flexibility that you offer could go a long way toward increasing engagement and satisfaction and, of course, productivity. Finally, I'd encourage you to take a hard look at your performance evaluation processes and ensure that you're rewarding productivity rather than engagement. So don't reward people for just being on video calls all day. Reward them for what they're getting done. I've seen some larger organizations even create new roles like Director of Remote Work that oversee production and collaboration. They get feedback from employees on what is and isn't working, and they can help ensure operational efficiency. So on the next slide, I want to talk about burnout. This is something that I heard our panel talk about a lot and various strategies to avoid it. In one survey of remote workers, 59% of respondents, regardless of their role, reported a tendency to overwork and to not take breaks throughout the day. I have to admit, I totally related to Heather's lament of just all day, every day on Zoom, and I am not always that great about taking breaks myself. In PwC's workforce survey, we found similar results. 1/4 of employees reported that their physical and mental health have either gotten somewhat or much worse during the pandemic. So as leaders, we need to recognize this problem and start to address it. There were some great suggestions earlier for quiet days and meeting-free periods. I would add to that the importance of setting clear expectations for how much work is enough. Women in particular can be vulnerable to imposter syndrome, feeling like everyone else is working smarter and better and harder. Now, when we're in the work from anywhere model, anytime we do something that's not work-related, even if it's a quick 2 minutes to throw in a load of laundry while we're on calls, we might feel like we've been slacking and then work later at night to make up for it. But at the office, there's a lot of time there that's spent not working too. So the remedy here is to make sure you're measuring your teams by what they're getting done, not how many hours of video meetings they're in and at their desk and not multitasking. To this end, I'd also encourage you to get really comfortable with asynchronous communications and establish working norms for your team for using them. So on my team, I found that over the last year, we've kind of moved away from email and we've started sending questions and requests by IM. And that's not necessarily a good way to go. It makes people feel like they have to reply or do things as soon as they get that message. Instead, establish a culture that messages outside of work hours don't have to be replied to immediately and they can wait. And as a leader, try not to send messages outside your team's working hours, whatever those may be, so that they don't feel the pressure to respond. I recently had a conversation with my boss around our morning routines, and we laughed about the fact that we typically both jump on our computers first thing, and then we end up sneaking our workout and shower in like sometime midday. That kind of honesty, even just about like my shower habits, made me feel so much better about what I really thought of as slacking. And I stopped worrying about the fact that I was in gym clothes and had no makeup on our 8 a.m. stand-up calls. Now, as for your own work, there's a couple things that I suggest you do to help create more of that boundary between work and home, even while you are working from home. So first, create a defined workspace. Even if you're living in a studio apartment, designate a corner of your living room or even an office chair at your kitchen table that is exclusively for work, and commit to working only in that space. So don't be skimming emails in bed or taking a call from your couch, no matter how comfy it might be. This will help you avoid work outside of work hours, and it allows you to physically step out of work mode when your workday ends. I'd also suggest that you try to set a clear and consistent schedule with defined start and stop times for your day. It might feel unresponsive and inflexible, but we used to commute to and from the office at defined times, so think of this in the same way. Trust me, I know it's really easy to say yes to a 6 a.m. call with the East Coast, but I find that even if I take that call in my gym clothes and I'm planning to take a break at 8 a.m. to get my run in, I often get mired in calls and emails and IMs, and I never end up getting that time to myself. Before you turn on your computer or pick up the phone in the morning, start with a consistent morning routine that gets you started on the right foot. And then in the evening, plan something at a defined time as your end of day. I've started organizing what we call a healthy happy hour with my coworkers, where we all jump on our Peloton bikes at the same time in the evening. In general, I found that while I'm usually a morning workout person, an evening workout actually helps me transition from work mode to home mode, and I'm a lot less likely to get back on my laptop if I do a spin or a yoga class before dinner. Whether you like to work out or not, consider creating some form of a virtual commute, whether it's reading a novel or listening to music for 20 minutes like you might do on a bus into the office, or just going for a walk around the block. This morning, my boss admitted that he quote, commutes to his home office in his garage by getting coffee in the kitchen, and then he walks across the lawn with his coffee and laptop in hand, thinking about his priorities for the day. Then on his way home from the office, before he leaves his little garage home office, he takes a few minutes to write down his priorities for the next day on a pad that he leaves in the office, and then he walks back, the 30 seconds to his house with his mind clear, and he's able to think about his family and the time he's about to spend with them. I love this idea. And I think, whether you adopt this or something else, just don't jump right from work into dinner, or even worse, go back and forth between. So finally, the third slide that I want to share with you around some tips is strengthening relationships. If we could just go forward one more slide, please. Perfect. So in our September PwC Pulse survey from last year, we had 41% of CHROs who were expressing concerns about a weakened corporate culture in a virtual world. as we've all learned in the last year, a Zoom event is not just as simple as turning cameras on and expecting people to replicate that in-person conversation. One of the challenges is that when you're on camera, it can kind of feel performative, like everyone is listening and you have to say things perfectly. And so people are a little intimidated to speak up, particularly when it's in a larger group. Plus, it means you can't have the side conversations or, glances that were normal in a conference room. So I suggest encouraging your employees to use the chat feature of video calls to have side conversations even while someone else is speaking. And also make time for small talk. Relationships are often built at the water cooler, in the workplace, but that doesn't exist in a virtual world. And in this new work from anywhere model, yes, you might have some people who have the break room at the office, but you need to find ways to ensure that both those inside and outside the office are included. I had mentioned earlier, I think it's important that you and your employees find designated days and times to come together, like the creation of core hours, a specific day or time when everyone on the team makes it a point to be in the office. For people with more dispersed workforces, like those who I had mentioned moving more than 50 miles away from the office, try co-locations, or colos for short. So at PwC Digital, we do 2 colos per year. The entire organization flies to one city to meet in person, work together, learn together, and, have some fun too. One unique idea is when you bring your employees together for this, send them home with $50 that they can use on a thank you gift for their loved ones and kind of spread that culture a little bit further. At PwC, we've been doing digital colos the last year with designated times that we turn our cameras on and work together. I've heard that idea mentioned a lot, and I have to say it's a lot more fun when you do it infrequently, twice a year, rather than all the time, which I've seen some of my clients try. As part of our digital colos, we'll also do keynote speeches and, even that mandatory fun, like we were talking earlier about the beer tastings or things like that. We also, whether at our colos or sometimes throughout the year, we've offered like Grubhub or DoorDash gift cards for people to invite others to lunch, and even if it's just on cameras in your own homes. And just remind everyone of the importance of taking time out to chat about non-work topics and build those relationships. It is tougher in a virtual or a work-from-anywhere world, and that's where it's on each of us to take the time to prioritize those relationships and make sure you're still getting to connect, even if it's not in person. So with that, we'll go to the last slide, and I'll just say thank you so much again for having me here. I really hope this talk has been the start of building a relationship with some of you. I would love it if you'd reach out on LinkedIn to introduce yourself, and we can definitely continue to strengthen our virtual Denver women's leadership community. So any questions based on anything I've talked about? I know I covered a lot.
Yes, Laura, that was a wonderful presentation. I know I personally got a couple of tips out of it. We've had some questions that came in from the chat, and I will say that a lot of our questions came in that Laura is not a lawyer. So some of the questions kind of...
Not a lawyer. Definitely not a lawyer.
So like some of the tips that came in, and I think it's a lot of the questions that we came in are just questions that we all just have about vaccines and asking about vaccines, and I think so some of the questions I might have to skip today. But I'm going to start with this first one, and this one came from Melanie, and she said, has your company come up with any tips for managers that have to deal with some of their employees that don't want to follow the office rules? For example, any fun tips on telling people to put that mask over their nose?
That's a great question, Melanie. So, at PwC, I'll be honest, we are still not back in the office. Our offices have remained closed. But I can tell you what I've seen with a lot of my clients, some of whom have been in the office throughout all of this. And I think a big piece of it is communicating those expectations up front, and then reminding people that if they're not able to follow them, they have the opportunity to work from home. I realize it's not always a choice. Sometimes you have to have employees that are in the office, and that's where I think you need to get strict on following the rules that you've put into place. But I think so much of it is about just communicating those expectations up front so people know what to expect when they are there in person.
Nice. So the next question comes from Esther, and it says, it seems that our team has been experiencing pandemic fatigue and burnout. What are any advice for plans to kind of reignite the team when it is time for us to come back into the office and work?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think one of the keys there, I mean, I could certainly give you lots of ideas for various team building things, whether it's wine tastings or, going rock climbing or whatever else. But I think, there's tons of ideas like that out there. And what I would just remind you is that everyone is going to have a different comfort level when you come back. I can say this even just this week. I hosted a small get-together at my house finally for, 8 of my friends where we're all fully vaccinated and we can all come back together. And even in that small group, there were some people who felt really comfortable, who have, been going to restaurants all year and seeing people, and they haven't had as much concern. And then there were other people who this was the first time they had seen friends in months. Remember that your employees are going to have those same feelings. So try to make sure that you're providing kind of some options for them. If you are coming back together in person, recognize there will be some people who are still stepping back and keeping their distance, and you're not necessarily going to go back to the same, hugs and team building that you might have done pre-pandemic.
That's great advice. And Laura, I totally understand. I went to a friend's house on Saturday night, and some of it's even strange. Like, I was totally fine when we were all just sitting in the backyard chatting, but when there were like 10 people in someone's kitchen, even myself, I was like, oh.
Yeah.
Oh, and I think we're also just not used to it.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that goes along with that is there can be, particularly when you're talking about these team building things, there can be some resistance to those of people thinking, well, this isn't really necessary. Do we need to be doing this? Which, I mean, obviously a strong culture is important, but it can create kind of feelings of guilt, for taking these risks. And I've seen that, with a lot of these social events where people are like, gosh, I feel good about going to the grocery store because I know I have to do that, but how do I feel about a happy hour that's optional? So just be aware that your employees are going to have those feelings and help them to kind of reintegrate at whatever pace feels most comfortable for them.
Yes, I personally really want to go to a baseball game. I really missed it. So this is going to be our last question. We had a lot of questions coming about vaccines, so I was trying to find one that was like kind of generic, and this will be our last question before I ask you for some final thoughts. And this is kind of
Sure.
a generic question. With the uncertainties that continue to exist around vaccines, what kind of impacts could they have long term on companies reopening?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you need to plan for the fact that not all of your employees will be vaccinated, or not all of your employees will be willing to let you know that they've been vaccinated because they still feel that that's, personal health information that they don't want to share. So as much as we want to look to those vaccines as solving everything, I think the vaccines are really only a piece of the puzzle. And they can allow you to feel more confident when you're going back into the workplace, but they're not necessarily going to get us 100% of the way there. So rather than thinking about it as going back to, the old model of everything in person and exactly how things were, you need to be thinking about what does this new hybrid model look like? What activities ought to be in person, and where might virtual activities be even better than maybe, for example, the travel I was talking about earlier. Saves my clients a lot of money now that they know I can be reached on, a Zoom video rather than having to fly across the country and stay in a hotel. So I think just be mindful of the fact that it is ever changing, and where things are, I would say, in the next month or two is probably where they're likely to be for quite some time. I think there's a little bit of optimism with thinking, oh, by fall, everything will be open, everything will be back to normal. I think it's pretty likely that things will all be open by then, but calling things back to normal, I think that's something we're not likely to get to for several years down the line.
Very well said. Thank you. Well, I think it is time for us to wrap up for the afternoon. So as we wrap up, do you have any final words of wisdom or thoughts to pass along to our listeners today?
Well, I think just going off of what I was just saying, I hope that no one takes this as, a pessimistic view. I think the world of work is changing, and it's a really exciting time. It used to be that doing things online and doing things virtually was seen as lesser than, and you couldn't get as much done. But now it's opening up so many opportunities for flexibility. So embrace that flexibility and just make sure you're working with your employees to avoid some of that burnout that can happen from the virtual options.
All right, well, thank you so much for being with us today. So thank you, Laura, and thanks to all our speakers today, both our panel members and our keynote speakers. And thank you to all our listeners. Without all of you, these events wouldn't be possible. So let's continue to support women's leadership and learn from one another. So be safe, be kind to yourselves, and be well. So until next time, this is Ginger Whatley signing off.